it's a two-phase project. The first phase was completed 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. And that's where we came in and did an overlay of just the driving surface. We did some, reconstructed some of the ADA compliant ramps transitioning from one side of the square to the other. Put in detectable warnings as part of that project and those ADA crosswalks. We removed the center curbing that delineated the outside lane from the inside lane of the square. A couple of problems with that we encountered with that. Although it created a nice buffer or barrier to keep vehicles from hitting one another, those were all replaced with pavement markings. A couple of things were gained by that. Some added lane width. We were able to also, we had some issues with snow removal up there because of those center medians. So those were removed, and some snow removal is much quicker, more efficient for our city crews, and they're not at the end of the day tearing up the curbing that was there. I will say I think it was an attractive feature, but from a practical standpoint, it did create some problems. Now, some of the pluses we were able to get from, in addition to the ADA compliance, was we put in some great aesthetic improvements, including some large islands in all four corners of the square, again delineating the interior from the inside lane from the outside lane. They added a really nice green feature, plus gave us an opportunity, I think, to maybe showcase the sculpture program that the downtown development director was essentially getting in place even before the initial first phase of the revitalization. And we've now become more compliant with ADA parking on the square. And in general, I think we presented made a huge first step in doing the revitalization. And at the end of the day, I think there were some people who would say, well, if this is all we can afford to do, or if we're not successful in getting the grant from the Department of Transportation, the ITEP grant, then maybe this is okay. But we know that there's got to be more done, and that's going to be in the second phase. Right about what we had budgeted for, in my recollection, was around $1.3 million. The majority of that, well, all of that was out of our own infrastructure sales tax fund. There was no state or federal funds involved in that. That was all local tax dollars being reinvested in the downtown square. You know, we want to make it clear that first and foremost, we're going to come in and tear up some of that pavement we just got through improving 2 years ago. And we knew that from the beginning. And I think that I want to be upfront about that, because I think there may be some scrutiny, a little criticism. Well, didn't you just put all this brand new asphalt down? Why are you tearing it up again? Well, we proceeded with phase one, not knowing if we were ever going to get phase two funded through the ITEP grant. So we did our very best effort, but we also knew that if we were successful in getting the ITEP, it would be focused on rehabbing the sidewalks in front of the storefronts and around the entire square. So when we go in and we start fixing grades changes between, for example, there's a huge grade change on the west side of the square, particularly in front of the computer source, the former Vitamin Lady, large curb there that you have to step up on. And the farther north you go, the more pronounced the curb. Whereas on the east side, that pronounced curb is not there. So we have to account for those grade changes without at the same time messing up any of the drainage flow issues on the square. So we'll have to take out essentially all the pavement around that abuts the existing sidewalk that is about equal to the entire width of the parking stall in front of all those buildings. And so we can make the height of the new sidewalk consistent with what will then be new pavement height, so that you're not we're offsetting those differences in curb height so that they're more consistent around the entire square. So we'll eliminate any trip, slip, fall hazards that are created by, in some cases, concrete that's literally decades old and in various states of repair. We'll be able to allow for direct access into all storefronts without any grade changes. It would be barriers, no steps, so they would be ADA compliant. And at the same time, add some additional aesthetics as far as We're going to incorporate some tree plantings, and we have to wink and nod a little bit about that because those are not part of the original IDOT approved plans, but we're going to undertake those replanting of trees in the sidewalks that are around various locations around the square. Some will be in the same place they are now, some will not. We're going to do a little better job at utilizing both the engineering firm that we hired to put this plan together, and our local arborists, and some input from folks that live and interact on the square on a daily basis. So there'll be a second phase, if you will, of more greening of the square. So a lot of the white pavement markings that delineate free space, so to speak, will be filled with plantings and be much more inviting aesthetically and a little more pedestrian friendly, all in all, at the end of the day. One of the key issues we were trying to solve from the very beginning of this was safety concerns on the square, the ability for firefighters and ambulances and things to get around the square unencumbered, and improve pedestrian access, and to be ADA compliant. So at the end of the day, we'll have all that done when this second phase is complete. The first phase, as I said, was all on local infrastructure sales tax. Back in 2011, the citizens of Macomb enacted a full 1 cent sales tax to be collected specifically for the purposes of maintaining or improving infrastructure. The city council at the time, and I was on the councils the same year I was elected to mayor, but the city's council's word was that if this were passed by the citizens, it would be primarily and nearly exclusively used for roadway improvements. And so that tax is collected on virtually everything with the exception of food, medicine, implements of husbandry, and titled vehicles. So we don't collect it on car sales. We don't collect it from any sales of farm implements at Berkey's or John Deere. We don't collect it on food, and we don't collect it on medicine. But everything else we collect 1% sales tax. I think we've been good stewards with that money. It has not went as far as we would hoped. For example, with the decline in enrollment at the university and with the transition nationwide to internet sales of retail products, and we've had that conversation about how we need to buy local for many reasons, but that's an additional one. We lose that sales tax when internet sales take place. There's some movement both at the state and federal level to change that, but it's not in place yet. So we've lost that income as folks have transitioned to buying things on the internet. So not to get too far off on a tangent, but the idea is that money's being collected, we're using it. Right now, we're collecting roughly $1.6 million a year in that fund. We would have projected that we would be, when we enacted it back in 2011, we would have projected that we'd be collecting close to $2 million. And you're saying, well, 1.6 is close. Well, that's $400,000 less a year. Over 10 years, that's $4 million less money we have to do projects. So we've had to adjust a little bit and set our sights a little more reasonable. We did do an initial bond issue for $7.5 million back in 2012. And we're making debt service payments out of that $1.6 million. So about $600,000 of that, what we collect, goes to pay that debt service on those bonds. The other $1 million goes to projects like we're going to do downtown. So just, not to get too far off, but some of the project, we'd say, well, what'd you do with that $7.5 million originally, Mayor? Well, we did a complete rehabilitation of Carroll Street from Campbell out to Pearl. We've reconstructed some bridges in town. And we completely redid Ward Street from Jackson to Adams. We've done some improvements on University Drive and Western Avenue. Part of that went to a match for the reconstruction of the Wigwam Hollow Bridge. The majority of that, don't get me wrong, was paid by state and federal dollars, but we did have to have some match in there. So, it's probably one of the biggest things we deal with in City Hall is public works, and specifically streets and the status of streets and what they look like. So we're doing our due diligence, and one of the projects that will take up a good portion of this next year's fiscal budget for that infrastructure sales tax money is the improvements on the square. So the 1.3 was all taken care of out of that fund the first phase. We are getting a $2 million, this is actually a $2 million second phase, and about half of that, maybe a little more of that, will be picked up by a Department of Transportation ITEP grant, which is specifically designed for funding projects like this, particularly in a historic district. So about 1.1 million will go or come actually from the Department of Transportation and a ITEP grant, and then the other $1 million will come from the Infrastructure Sales Tax Fund. That will be a huge chunk, and once that's done this coming year, we'll be able to transition that money in the future to many more projects in the city.
Okay.
I'm going to be honest with you. We had hoped to have gotten on the January bid letting, and so that we could have started as soon as the weather breaks in late March or early April. The traditional start of the construction season is somewhere around April 1st, April 15th. Got to have, as far as excavation, it's not critical. Temperature's not so critical, but when you're talking about pouring concrete or paving or anything like that, though, you have to worry about ambient air temperature. So our engineering firm has indicated maybe we'll be on the March letting and then start early summer. It will take an entire construction season to complete this project. There will be some inconvenience for folks on the square. One reason we went with the engineering firm that we chose for this project is that they've done this type of work in several other communities around us, particularly and specifically in Jacksonville, and they had a really good history of communicating with store owners as the construction process went along, making sure the construction company, the contractor, was good about leaving the workspace accessible to store owners and store operations during the construction. And so that's what we're going to count on. Is it will be messy. We know that. We understand that. We're going to ask for those folks that have been involved in this process almost from the very beginning. And I'm going to sidetrack here for just a second. When we first looked at undertaking this project, the then administrator, Dean Torreson, myself, the city council all decided that we wanted as many stakeholders at the table to help us with the design and vet the project as we could. We had a pretty consistent group of a couple of dozen downtown business owners, some of them from the county government. We tried to involve as many people as we could in the decision-making process from the very beginning, including the design elements, the implementation, and keeping open lines of communication. We had some hiccups, but they were not huge, and we had good information flowing out to folks who were impacted by that construction. And we'll just make sure we do the best job we can in this phase too. So, but again, I don't want anybody to think this is going to be, one and done. We'll have a little dust to deal with. No, it's a pretty major event. We're going to completely redo the entire store fronts, sidewalks in front of all these buildings. It'll be phased. The whole square won't be closed down at once. And we'll try to make it as painless as possible, but there will be some discomfort, and we'll all just get through it together. Well, I think as we've talked about the overall downtown, we're talking about the historic district goes from Calhoun to Jefferson and from Campbell to MacArthur. So that's a pretty wide swath. And I think the council has expressed in the past, and we think that it's probably a good idea to look at a phase 3 where we would be doing other improvements to connect, for example, the train station, the transit facility. We did some improvements on Adams Street to get a corridor, pedestrian-friendly corridor established between those residential components affiliated with the university and college students, and so that we have a corridor identified to get them from their residences in the heart of campus to the downtown. And there's been some discussions about improvements, pedestrian improvements on North Randolph and North Lafayette Street that would tie into Chandler Park and eventually tie in to the transfer facility and the Amtrak station. I think those would be logical next steps. And we think that we can make a good case for ITEP participation and grant funding in those. And when we include those as part of that grant application. We'll see. We've got a myriad of other projects that our infrastructure sales tax fund can and should be utilized for, a long list of improvements. And I think as we look at what our priorities are, I think we have to look at the possibility of another phase 3, but we also have to weigh that out with some of our other priorities in the community. And again, I think the majority of that would depend on the availability of grant funding from the state or federal government.